Before we begin, if you enjoy inspiring stories about courage, kindness, and the everyday heroes who quietly change lives, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes true strength is often hidden behind ordinary faces. Now, let's begin. The biggest mistake a criminal can make is believing the quietest person in the room is the weakest. At exactly 9:12 on a cool Tuesday morning, Maple Ridge Community Bank looked like every other neighborhood bank in America. Parents deposited paychecks before school pickup. Retirees chatted politely while waiting in line. A young couple counted every dollar before applying for their first home loan. Behind window number 3 stood Emily Carter, 36 years old, wearing a pressed navy blue uniform, a simple silver name tag, and the same warm smile customers had trusted for nearly 7 years. She greeted every person by name whenever she could, remembered birthdays, asked about grandchildren, and never rushed anyone, even during the busiest hours. To the people of Cedar Falls, she was simply the friendly bank teller who always stayed calm, no matter how stressful the day became. What nobody knew was that Emily carried silence the way other people carried scars. Every morning before unlocking her station, she touched the worn leather watch on her wrist for just a second, as though honoring someone who was no longer there. Then she quietly began another ordinary day. At 9:17, the front doors swung open. 3 strangers stepped inside wearing baseball caps and dark jackets, despite the warm weather. Most customers barely noticed them. Emily did. Her eyes moved naturally across the lobby, taking in every detail without changing her expression. One customer stood too close to the entrance. An elderly man leaned heavily on a cane near the waiting chairs. A little girl colored on the floor beside her mother with a box of crayons. Emily's smile never disappeared, but something behind her eyes sharpened. Seconds later, one of the newcomers loudly demanded everyone's attention. Conversation stopped. The room fell into complete silence. Customers froze where they stood as confusion spread across every face. Without raising her voice or showing panic, Emily slowly lifted one hand, meeting the frightened eyes of the little girl across the lobby. She gave the smallest, reassuring nod imaginable, a gesture so natural that almost no one noticed it. Almost no one except the man who had just decided she would become his hostage. The man pointed directly at Emily without a second of hesitation. "You, step away from the counter." His voice was controlled, almost calm, which somehow unsettled everyone even more. Around the lobby, customers lowered their eyes, hoping not to be noticed. Emily did the opposite. She looked at him with steady attention, not challenging him, not surrendering to panic, simply listening. "It is all right," she said softly to the elderly man beside the counter. "Please take one careful step back." Her quiet tone spread through the room faster than fear. The little girl who had been coloring moments earlier reached for her mother's hand. Emily noticed the movement immediately and shifted slightly, placing herself between them and the center of the lobby without making the gesture obvious. The robber ordered her forward again. She obeyed without argument, moving slowly enough that everyone else had time to stay still. As he secured her wrists with a plastic restraint, the cuff of her uniform slid back just an inch. A faded military tattoo briefly appeared on the inside of her left wrist before disappearing beneath the sleeve again. The robber frowned for a fraction of a second. He grabbed her arm and pulled the fabric back farther. "What is this?" he asked with a mocking grin. Several customers looked over, expecting Emily to explain herself. She simply glanced at the tattoo and answered, "It has not mattered for a very long time." The robber laughed. "Looks like somebody wanted to play soldier." A few nervous chuckles escaped from people who did not know how else to react under pressure. Emily never defended herself. She lowered her eyes and remained silent. Across the lobby, an older customer sitting near the loan office suddenly stopped breathing for a moment. His gaze stayed fixed on the small symbol. His hands trembled as memories he had buried years ago came rushing back. He had seen that exact emblem only once before, and it had belonged to people whose names were never printed in newspapers. He looked from the tattoo to Emily's calm expression, then quietly whispered to himself, No, there is no way. At that exact moment, the first police cruisers arrived outside the bank, and the long day was only beginning. Outside the bank, flashing lights reflected across the glass doors as officers quickly secured the surrounding streets. Inside, the silence felt heavier than the walls themselves. Nobody dared move unless instructed. Emily remained exactly where she had been placed, her breathing slow and even, her attention quietly shifting from one frightened face to another. She noticed the young mother struggling to comfort her daughter without making a sound. She noticed the elderly man gripping his cane so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Without saying a word, Emily gently caught the little girl's eye again and offered another reassuring smile, so small that only the child could see it. Somehow, the little girl stopped crying. Across the lobby, the older customer who had recognized the tattoo kept replaying distant memories in his mind. More than 20 years earlier, during a veteran charity event, he had briefly met members of a specialized military unit whose identities were carefully protected. Their insignia had never been displayed publicly. Yet the symbol on Emily's wrist was unmistakable. His pulse quickened. Either he was remembering incorrectly, or the quiet bank teller standing a few yards away had once belonged to a world very few Americans even knew existed. Outside, hostage negotiator Daniel Brooks arrived and immediately requested access to the building's security cameras. As the live video appeared on the command monitor, he expected to see panic. Instead, one person stood out. Emily never pulled attention toward herself. She subtly guided frightened customers with calm eye contact, small gestures, and steady posture, creating order without anyone realizing they were following her lead. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Years of crisis negotiation had taught him to recognize behavior under extreme pressure. Ordinary people froze, pleaded, or reacted emotionally. Emily was doing none of those things. She looked remarkably like someone who had spent years training to remain composed when everyone else could not. Behind him, the older veteran was finally escorted outside. Before anyone could ask why he seemed so shaken, he pointed toward the monitor with trembling fingers and quietly said, "Forget the robbery for 1 minute. Find out who that woman really is, because I do not believe she is only a bank teller." Daniel Brooks kept watching the security monitor without saying a word. Every movement Emily made raised another question instead of answering the last one. She never tried to become the center of attention, yet frightened customers instinctively looked toward her before making even the smallest decision. When one elderly woman began breathing too quickly, Emily quietly nodded toward a nearby chair. The woman understood immediately and slowly sat down. Moments later, the young mother holding her daughter noticed Emily gently motioning for her to keep the child focused on the coloring book instead of the growing crowd near the entrance. Somehow the little girl obeyed without asking why. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. "She is managing the emotional temperature of the entire room," he quietly observed. One of the officers beside him frowned. "Maybe she is just naturally calm." Daniel slowly shook his head. "No, natural calm does not look like this. She is observing exits, tracking every person in the lobby, measuring distances without obviously turning her head, and keeping people emotionally stable at the same time. That is trained behavior." Inside the bank, the robber noticed none of it. He remained convinced that he had chosen the safest hostage in the building because she never argued and never resisted. Mistaking composure for weakness, he ordered Emily to accompany him toward the manager's office while continuing to mock the faded tattoo on her wrist. "Funny how people hang on to old memories," he said with a dismissive smile. Emily answered with the same quiet voice she had used all morning. "Some memories are not meant to be forgotten." The simple reply lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Outside, the older veteran repeated his description of the military symbol to investigators with remarkable precision. A federal liaison, listening nearby, suddenly stopped taking notes. He quietly stepped away, made a secure phone call, and carefully repeated the description one more time. There was a long silence on the other end before a calm voice finally answered, "Do not speculate. Send me the image immediately." As the photograph from the security camera reached the secure database, someone hundreds of miles away stared at the screen, stood up without another word, and reached for an old service jacket that had not left the closet in years. Inside the bank, the tension quietly shifted. The robber believed he controlled every person in the room. Yet Emily continued to influence the situation without ever challenging his authority. When he ordered everyone to remain silent, she noticed the elderly customer struggling to keep his balance. Without taking a single unnecessary step, she calmly said, "Sir, please lean against the chair behind you. It will support your back." The robber glanced over, saw nothing threatening, and allowed it. A few moments later, the frightened little girl buried her face against her mother's shoulder again. Emily caught the mother's eyes and gave one slow nod, encouraging her to keep whispering softly instead of crying. The atmosphere settled just enough to prevent panic from spreading. Daniel Brooks watched everything from the command vehicle. The more he observed, the less convinced he became that Emily was simply surviving the situation. She was protecting every person around her while making it appear completely natural. "She has already prevented 3 separate panic reactions," Daniel quietly said. "Most people do not even realize she is doing it." One of the detectives looked at the monitor with growing curiosity. "She has never raised her voice once." Daniel nodded. "Because she understands something the rest of us do not." At that same moment, the federal liaison received a secure reply from the military archive. The emblem itself could not be publicly identified, but one line immediately caught everyone's attention. Restricted personnel marqueur. Verification required through retired commanding officer authorization. The liaison slowly lowered the tablet. "This is no ordinary service tattoo." Hundreds of miles away, retired Colonel Nathan Pierce was already on his way to a military airfield after receiving the photograph. During the drive, he stared silently at the image on his phone. The faded symbol, the worn leather watch, and the calm expression combined into a face he had not expected to see again. He quietly whispered a single name under his breath. "Emily." Back inside the bank, the robber noticed her old watch while tightening his grip on her arm. "You really should throw that thing away," he mocked. Emily glanced at the scratched leather band and answered with quiet certainty. "It reminds me that someone else's life will always matter more than my own." For the first time since entering the bank, the robber stopped smiling. Daniel Brooks replayed the security footage for the 3rd time, slowing each sequence until individual movements became impossible to ignore. Emily never looked directly toward the exits, yet somehow she always knew where everyone was standing. She subtly adjusted her position whenever the frightened customer shifted, creating small pockets of calm without attracting attention. Years of negotiation had taught Daniel to recognize leadership under pressure, and what he was seeing did not resemble instinct alone. It resembled discipline forged over countless hours of training. "She is protecting people without making the situation worse," he quietly told the command team. "That takes extraordinary control." Across the temporary command center, the federal liaison received another secure message. This one contained only a single instruction: maintain visual contact. Retired Colonel Nathan Pierce is en route. No further explanation followed. The room grew noticeably quieter. Even experienced officers recognized that retired military commanders were rarely contacted during civilian hostage situations. Inside the bank, the robber became increasingly frustrated. Every attempt to intimidate the room seemed strangely ineffective. Nobody was panicking anymore. The customers remained frightened, but they were listening to Emily's calm voice instead of their own fear. He ordered her to move closer to the front entrance where everyone could see her. Emily complied without hesitation. As she walked, she quietly noticed a teenage employee trembling behind a service desk. Without turning her head, she said softly, "Keep breathing. Count to 5. Then begin again." The young employee followed the simple instruction, and the shaking slowly stopped. The robber stared at her with growing suspicion. "Why is everyone listening to you?" he demanded. Emily met his eyes for the first time in several minutes. "Because fear spreads quickly," she answered. "But so does calm." Her words lingered in the silent lobby. Outside, Colonel Nathan Pierce's vehicle finally entered Cedar Falls. During the drive, he had not spoken once. Resting on the passenger seat beside him was an old personnel file marked permanently closed years earlier. The photograph clipped inside showed a much younger Emily Carter standing beside her unit, wearing the same quiet expression she carried today. Looking at the file, the colonel whispered with unmistakable regret, "You carried that burden alone for far too long." He closed the folder, knowing that before the day ended, the truth buried for nearly 15 years would no longer remain hidden. Inside the bank, time seemed to move more slowly with every passing minute. The robber paced between the entrance and the customer lobby, convinced that patience alone would force everyone to break. Instead, the opposite happened. The frightened whispers gradually disappeared, replaced by an unusual stillness that Emily had quietly nurtured from the moment the crisis began. She never gave instructions loudly. She never drew attention to herself. Yet each reassuring glance, every measured breath, and every calm response reminded the people around her that panic would only make the situation harder. Outside, Daniel Brooks noticed the same pattern. "He believes he controls the room," Daniel said quietly to the officers, standing beside him. "But emotionally, she has been leading these people from the beginning." Nobody disagreed anymore. The command team had stopped asking whether Emily possessed special training. Their only question now was how extensive that training had been. At the temporary command post, Colonel Nathan Pierce finally arrived carrying the weather personnel file. He studied the enlarged photograph of Emily displayed on the operations monitor for several long seconds before speaking. "She still watches every doorway first," he said softly. Daniel turned toward him. "You know her?" The colonel nodded without taking his eyes off the screen. Years ago, before she ever worked behind a bank counter, she volunteered for assignments where protecting innocent people always came before protecting herself. Daniel waited for him to continue, but the colonel simply closed the file again. "The rest can wait. Right now, she is doing exactly what she was trained to do." Inside the bank, the robber's frustration continued to grow. He pointed toward the front windows and demanded that Emily stand where everyone outside could clearly see her. She complied without complaint. As she stepped forward, she quietly noticed the elderly veteran struggling to hide his concern. Their eyes met for only a moment. Emily offered the faintest smile, almost as though reassuring an old friend instead of stranger. The veteran lowered his head, suddenly understanding something that everyone else had missed. She was not remaining calm because she expected someone to rescue her. She was remaining calm because, deep inside, she had already decided that every frightened person in that bank would leave safely before she ever thought about herself. Colonel Nathan Pierce finally opened the weather personnel file that had remained sealed for nearly 15 years. The officers gathered around him expected immediate answers, but instead he quietly removed a faded photograph. It showed a younger Emily standing beside several teammates whose faces had been partially obscured before the image was archived. Daniel Brooks studied the picture, then looked back at the live security feed. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same steady eyes, the same composed posture. "What unit was this?" Daniel asked. The colonel hesitated before answering. "One that was trained to keep innocent people alive, even when every decision carried consequences that lasted a lifetime." Daniel sensed there was much more to the story, but he also understood why the older man was choosing every word carefully. Inside the bank, the robber grew increasingly irritated by the lack of panic around him. He paced across the lobby, demanding complete silence, expecting fear to spread with every passing minute. Instead, customers continued drawing quiet reassurance from Emily's presence. Without speaking directly to anyone, she maintained calm through simple eye contact, patient breathing, and the quiet confidence that somehow reminded frightened strangers they were not alone. Even the little girl had stopped crying completely. Watching from outside, Daniel finally understood what had been bothering him since arriving. Emily was not merely remaining calm. She was deliberately preserving hope. That required preparation far beyond ordinary life experience. At the command vehicle, a A secure message appeared on the Federal Liaison's tablet. Identity probability exceeds 98%. Final confirmation pending. Daniel looked toward Colonel Pierce. If that message confirms what you believe, why has nobody ever heard her name? The colonel slowly closed the file again. Because after the mission ended, she asked for exactly one thing. Daniel waited. The colonel answered quietly, almost as though speaking to himself. She wanted the people she saved to remember their families instead of remembering her. Inside the bank, the robber glanced once more at the faded tattoo on Emily's wrist. This time he did not laugh. Something about the growing confidence outside the building, the unusual patience of the negotiators, and the quiet respect beginning to spread through the room made him wonder whether the symbol he had dismissed as meaningless was connected to a story far larger than he had ever imagined. The atmosphere outside the bank changed the moment the Federal Liaison received the final confirmation. The secure database no longer displayed probability. It displayed certainty. Daniel Brooks looked toward Colonel Nathan Pierce, expecting relief, but the retired officer's expression only grew heavier. "It really is her," Daniel said quietly. The colonel nodded once. Emily Carter. He stared through the command vehicle window toward the bank. She always believed that if innocent people stayed calm, everyone had a better chance of going home. Daniel lowered his voice. "Tell me what happened." The colonel took a slow breath before answering. Years ago, during a hostage rescue, Emily volunteered to remain behind so dozens of civilians could be evacuated first. She never spoke about that day afterward. She only asked that every report focus on the families who made it home. Daniel remained silent. He finally understood why every instinct inside him had insisted that the quiet bank teller was different. Inside the lobby, the robber noticed police activity increasing outside the building. Vehículos reposicionados. Radios moved faster, yet nobody appeared to be rushing. The careful patience unsettled him more than any aggressive response could have. His eyes drifted back to Emily's faded tattoo. "What are they waiting for?" he asked suspiciously. Emily answered with complete honesty. "Probably the truth." He frowned. "About what?" She calmly looked across the room at the frightened customers before answering. "About whom matters most today." The simple reply left him more confused than before. Nearby, the elderly veteran quietly closed his eyes. He now remembered the story clearly. Years earlier, a military speaker had described an unnamed operator who refused public recognition after helping save innocent lives during an impossible crisis. No photographs had ever been released. No interviews had ever been given. Only one detail remained unforgettable. The speaker had said that the woman carried an old leather watch because every scratch reminded her that someone else's tomorrow was worth more than her own comfort. The veteran slowly opened his eyes and looked toward Emily's worn watch. His voice barely rose above a whisper. She was never hiding from her past. She was protecting everyone else's future. Colonel Nathan Pierce stood silently beside the command vehicle, his eyes fixed on the live image of Emily inside the bank. Around him, experienced officers waited for instructions, but the retired commander seemed lost in memories that only he could see. Finally, Daniel Brooks asked the question everyone had been holding back. "What made her leave?" The colonel took a long breath before answering. "It was never fear. It was grief." His voice remained steady, but every word carried quiet weight. "She volunteered for a hostage rescue that saved dozens of innocent people. The mission succeeded, but someone she trusted did not come home. Emily spent years believing that if she had made one different decision, that family might still be complete." Daniel looked back at the monitor where Emily continued speaking softly to frightened customers, never once drawing attention to herself. "So she walked away?" The colonel slowly nodded. "She did not walk away from service. She simply chose a different way to serve." Inside the bank, the robber became increasingly uneasy. He could not explain why the negotiators outside seemed so patient or why the officers watching through the windows appeared more interested in Emily than in him. He glanced once more at the faded tattoo on her wrist and then at the old leather watch she still wore. "Who were you before this place?" he finally asked. Emily looked around the lobby before answering. Someone who learned that titles disappear, uniforms are folded away, and medals collect dust. The only thing people remember is whether you helped them when they needed it most. Her words settled over the room like a quiet promise. Even the customers who knew nothing about her past sensed that they were hearing something deeply personal. Outside, Daniel lowered his headset. She has spent the entire morning protecting strangers without asking for recognition. Colonel Pierce gave the faintest smile. That is because she never believed being a hero was an identity. To Emily, it was simply a responsibility. As another secure file arrived from Federal Archives, Daniel opened it expecting routine service records. Instead, the first page contained a citation describing an unnamed woman whose selfless decision had changed the lives of an entire community, and only 3 people outside that mission had ever been authorized to know her name. Daniel Brooks read the declassified citation twice before lowering the tablet in silence. It contained no dramatic language, no celebration, and no mention of medals. It simply recorded that one unnamed operator had refused evacuation until every civilian under her protection had reached safety, even after multiple opportunities to leave. The report concluded with a single sentence that stayed with him. Subject declined all public recognition and requested permanent anonymity. Daniel slowly looked back toward the security monitor. Behind the bank counter stood the same woman who now spent her days helping neighbors deposit paychecks and open savings accounts. She had traded extraordinary service for an ordinary life without asking anyone to know why. Beside him, Colonel Nathan Pierce quietly said, "That is the Emily I remember." She never wanted to be remembered for what she did. She wanted people to remember the lives that continued because they were given another chance. Inside the bank, the atmosphere had changed in ways the robber could not understand. Every frightened customer still looked concerned, yet their fear no longer felt hopeless. Emily continued offering nothing more than calm eye contact, patient breathing, and quiet reassurance whenever someone needed it. She never mentioned her past. She never pointed to the faded tattoo. She never attempted to explain herself. The robber studied her for a long moment before asking, "If everything they seem to believe about you is true, why are you standing behind a bank counter instead of wearing some uniform?" Emily smiled gently, almost as though the answer had been waiting inside her for years. Because people need kindness on ordinary Tuesdays just as much as they need courage on extraordinary days. The words settled over the room in complete silence. Even the robber lowered his eyes for a brief moment, unable to dismiss what he had just heard. Outside, Daniel felt his understanding shift completely. He had spent his career believing that heroes were defined by remarkable moments. Emily had quietly shown him something different. Real heroes continued serving long after the headlines disappeared. As another secure message reached the command post, Colonel Pierce finally nodded. Everything has now been verified. The time has come for the truth to be acknowledged. Not because Emily ever asked for recognition, but because everyone inside that bank deserves to understand whose quiet strength has been protecting them since the very first minute. Daniel Brooks placed his headset back on and spoke with quiet confidence that everyone in the command vehicle could hear. "We are proceeding carefully. Our priority remains exactly where Emily would want it. Every innocent person leaves safely." Colonel Nathan Pierce gave a slow nod of approval. She would accept nothing less. Inside the bank, the long hours of uncertainty had begun to wear on everyone. The customers looked exhausted, but they were no longer overwhelmed by fear. Emily continued moving through the room with quiet compassion whenever she was permitted, offering reassuring words to an anxious senior citizen, encouraging the young mother to keep her daughter focused on simple conversation, and reminding everyone to breathe slowly. She never once asked anyone to think about her. She only asked them to think about getting home. The robber watched her in growing disbelief. The more time passed, the less she resembled the frightened hostage he believed he had chosen. She carried herself with quiet confidence, not because she expected recognition, but because she refused to let despair take hold. Outside, Colonel Pierce finally stepped toward the public address system. Daniel looked at him with surprise. "Are you certain?" The colonel answered softly. She spent 15 years protecting this truth because she believed it belonged to the people she saved, not to herself. Today, revealing it may protect even more lives. With permission from the command team, he spoke clearly enough for his voice to carry into the lobby. Emily Carter, this is Colonel Nathan Pierce. The entire bank fell silent. Emily slowly closed her eyes for a brief moment before looking toward the entrance. She recognized the voice immediately. You once served your country with extraordinary honor, the colonel continued. You carried others to safety when you could have chosen your own. You asked never to be recognized, and your wish was respected. But today, everyone inside that building deserves to know they are standing beside someone who has spent her entire adult life protecting strangers. The room remained perfectly still. Customers slowly turned toward Emily with expressions of astonishment and gratitude. Even the robber stood speechless, realizing that the quiet bank teller he had underestimated had never stopped serving others. For the first time since the morning began, he understood that the strongest person in the building had been beside him all along, and she had never needed anyone to know her name. The crisis finally came to a peaceful end. One by one, frightened customers walked out of the bank and into the arms of waiting family members and first responders. Relief spread through the crowd like the first warm sunlight after a long storm. Daniel Brooks was among the first to step inside once the building was declared secure. His eyes searched the lobby until they found Emily sitting quietly in the same chair where she had spent so many hours comforting strangers. She looked tired, but her first question was not about herself. Is everyone safe? Daniel smiled with genuine respect. Yes, every single person. Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment and gently rested her hand on the worn leather watch that had never left her wrist. Outside, Colonel Nathan Pierce waited near the entrance. When Emily finally walked toward him, neither of them spoke immediately. 15 years of silence required no introduction. The colonel simply stood at attention and offered a crisp salute. Emily looked almost embarrassed by the gesture before quietly returning it. Around them, police officers, firefighters, emergency medical personnel, and even the bank employees instinctively grew silent. One after another, people who had witnessed her quiet courage lowered their heads with heartfelt respect. The elderly veteran stepped forward first. "Thank you," he said softly, "not only for today, for everything you never asked us to know." Emily smiled with the same warmth that had greeted customers every morning for 7 years. "The people who came home were always the story," she replied. "I was only fortunate enough to help." Daniel looked around the lobby that had returned to ordinary life. The counters were still there. The waiting chairs had not changed. Tomorrow, people would once again deposit paychecks, open savings accounts, and greet the friendly teller behind window number 3. Most of them would eventually forget the fear of that day. What they would never forget was discovering that true greatness rarely announces itself. Sometimes it wears an ordinary name tag, offers a reassuring smile, remembers your birthday, and quietly spends a lifetime protecting complete strangers without ever asking for applause. Because the strongest heroes are often the ones you never notice until the moment you need them most. And that is why no one should ever judge another human being by appearances alone. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone you care about. Every share helps more people discover the quiet heroes who make our world a better place. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.